Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to continue on with some of the stuff that we're doing with respect to history. So the last time we were talking about history, we had Julie and Grotto with us, who's been helping with the project. And as I noted, we're going to get more people helping with the project over time. So the first thing we did was look at find it, fix it, leave it alone. We were able to identify that while it is likely a verbal quote from Dr. Still, he never wrote it down. It was somebody else who wrote it down, quoting him verbally in a book, and I don't remember the name of the book off the top of my head. I could check it, but whatever. Anyways, it's in another video. So I haven't necessarily gone through this stuff frequently enough to encode that firmly. Anyways, we're going to go through across time different claimed conditions or different named conditions and what early osteopathic practitioners were reporting about what they did with them and where they found stuff. So we started to look at consumption or tuberculosis. So we looked at tuberculosis first, then started to recognize that the term that we were probably more so looking for early on was consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis that had been chronic and led to wasting, which is why it was called consumption. And there's a switch relatively quickly from consumption to tuberculosis. Now, tuberculosis as a term could be in many places because it's the tuberculi bacilli bacteria, tuberculi bacillus bacteria. I think that was identified initially in 1881. So 1881 to the early 1900s, not a particularly long period of time, so lots of investigation, lots of thought, lots of discussion, probably in many directions. One of the things that became relatively consistent across time, or across professions rather, seems to be clean outdoor air. So you would put the quote-unquote consumptive, or the person who had likely had pulmonary tuberculosis for a long time, in a relatively quote-unquote clean outdoor environment and have them breathe clean outdoor air, and that seemed to do something. And I think Dr. William Osler had a reasonable amount to do with that, or at least was supportive of that. And if we go through specifics in the articles that we pulled this information from, we can actually find the mention of Osler, which is why I'm noting it. So switching between terms, and when searching for tuberculosis specifically, there was a lot of discussion about tuberculosis of the hip. So we didn't focus on that. We were focusing specifically on mention of pulmonary tuberculosis, because what we're looking for is to see if, whether it's termed consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis, if there are similarities in the locations suggested for treatment, the structures related, or anything else with respect to treatment intervention that is consistent. So generally it seems like we more or less came up with, or were able to identify three, quote-unquote eras. So 1896 to 1899 seems to be the early area where all that was really said was find the specific lesion and remove it. So if you look at Dr. Still, he talks about treating from the head to the coccyx. Whatever's going on, that's what you treat, right? He has varying discussions in his books and in articles about saying, just find what's there, treat what is not moving, and go away. So similar to the concept of find it, fix it, leave it alone. Nature will kindly take care of the rest. Other writers between 1896 and 1899 more or less mirror that. There is one caveat. The first book written about osteopathy by E.D. Barber has a very, very specific protocol, and if I remember right, his protocol involves 2 assistants. Let's see. Yeah, so his treatment, so when you get to the term consumption, he says, see asthma treatment. The asthma treatment is there's 2 assistants holding down the scapula of a supine patient, draw their hands overhead. The assistants push up into the second rib, bring the arms down, assistants move hands to third rib, repeat ribs 1 through 5. So Barber had a protocol, ribs 1 through 5, with assistants, patient in supine. Then put the patient on a stool, put your knee in their T-spine, raise their arms, press your knee into their back, and then circle their arms backward. Then provide a general spinal treatment, which for him is a lateral patient with the practitioner in front, the patient's arm resting on the practitioner's arm, and then using the arm of the patient as a lever to aim more or less at the erector mass. That's how we've summarized this approach to treatment as described by Barber in 1896. So while we note that the early writings that were available, because there really wasn't anything before 1896, I believe, it might be 1895, is when the Journal of Osteopathic Medicine shows, or Journal of Osteopathy shows up. Then 1896 is when the first book from Barber shows up, and then writing picks up from there. So 1896 to 1899, most writers say find the lesion or find the restriction and remove it, and that should do it. Then we get into what we've termed more or less a middle era, and that is 1899 to 1903. Treatment starts to seem more by decree, so there's a set of steps that are suggested, do this, then do that, then do this, then do that, then do this sort of stuff. So it moves from find what's not moving and work on it to go to this area, do this, do this, do this, do this. And then 1903 on, we would call late, right? Where there is treatment by decree, but they also mention specifically with respect to pulmonary tuberculosis or consumption that you want to include diet, exercise, and hygiene. There's more variance in the treatment by decree, so the areas that they're suggesting that you work on, or the ways that they're suggesting you work on, whether it's patient position, are more variable. So we start off with general note that wherever the restriction is that you find, that you treat in those locations. So it's a highly variable suggestion, some more abstract suggestion. There is Dr. Still talking about, you know which strings to play for the lung. And he does get a little bit more prescriptive by the time you get into research and practice generally. Let me see where the heck it is. No, that is incorrect. There is one more thing he says. So by the time you get to research and practice, Dr. Still does say treat head to coccyx more or less, but he does make specific mention of excretory functions, and you'll see that in varying writers. They won't all talk about excretory functions, but they will speak to trying to get the body's excretory functions working better. With respect to the late era, the diet will vary. One of the things, especially with people who were considered consumptives or people who had had pulmonary tuberculosis for a long time, so they were wasting, they talk about having more or less a high-calorie diet, but also varying authors focus on heavy fat in the diet. So things like heavy cream. I think one of them was talking about bacon, if I remember right. And I don't remember it all specifically because we haven't drilled down on this and really, really repeated it a lot for the ability to communicate it specifically with respect to a particular article or a particular author. But generally, higher calorie diets, you want to try to fatten these people up. Having them take exercise, now that exercise could just be walking, but something that's going to make their breathing slightly more challenged so that they work on respiratory function or respiratory strength. There are some that mention measuring the excursion of the thoracic cage, and you're trying to increase it by a certain amount. Overall, we get to the point where they're focusing in more or less broadly with overlap and difference in specifics, T1 to T8, as well as ribs 1 through 8, more or less, and the argument there would be the relationship to the sympathetic nervous system primarily, a little bit less the parasympathetic. There is one author, and I don't remember who it was, but essentially said what you wanted to do was both in turn, at one point you want to stimulate the pneumogastric and then inhibit the vagus, something like that. Or one of them might have even said inhibit the vagus and stimulate the vagus. So they were just trying to get function to go up and down as if that was going to consistently work for everybody, which is unlikely. But the main thing is we seem to move from treat whatever you find to look in this area and do these steps in order, to look in this area, do these steps in order, add diet, exercise, and hygiene. The diet, exercise, and hygiene, in my memory does seem to be consistent with early osteopathic practitioners, especially once you kind of get 1905-ish, and then into when I've looked in the past at osteopathic reports about the Spanish flu. Diet and hygiene became very important with respect to the Spanish flu, or at least the reports that were there. So there does seem to be general thematic movement from treat what you find to treat by decree, then to treat by decree and consider diet, exercise, and hygiene. The hygiene being very, very important. We're talking about 1900 to 1910, more or less, whereby changes in hygiene seem to do huge amounts for the general health of the human population, as far as I'm aware. So that was a general thing going on, and the osteopathic practitioners seemed to be in lockstep with that, or in that same general direction for a variety of reasons. The thing that we now have to be more cautious with is pointing to hands-on treatment or manual osteopathic methods being the central thing with tuberculosis. We don't necessarily have good records of success. I definitely remember in looking through a bunch of these journals, again for the second time, we looked for find it, fix it, leave it alone before. Now we're looking for consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis. So there's general themes that you'll see because you're just scanning through the documents trying to find things. But the doctors of osteopathy were paying attention to the circumstances that they were in and adjusting on the fly. But we can't meaningfully say that it's the OMM. We can't meaningfully say that it's the hands-on stuff. We can say that generally they were moving towards being more physically robust and making those suggestions, sometimes very specific suggestions, considering dietary intervention, considering hygiene intervention. So the OMM is present, but it is variable in its report. That could simply be, that was where my mind was going. Please excuse me for the minor circle back. There were articles in these journals, so Journal of Osteopathy, Osteopathic Truth, Osteopathic Physician, journals of that nature. This probably wasn't in the bulletin of the Atlas and Nexus Club, but look through that a bunch, that were talking about how we record clinical data so that we can get a better picture of what's going on. Apparently, again, if memory serves properly, Ernest Tucker was trying to do some of that, or E.E. Tucker, Ernest Eckford Tucker, was trying to do some of that. So we see when we look at these early journals, even if we're looking for specific terms, we'll get the general gist or general sense that these people were trying to move towards some form of consistent reporting. It didn't really happen, but they were moving towards it. People like Louisa Burns would have been interested in stuff like that, even if not necessarily written in these articles or in these journals. But generally having some more consistent common reporting so that more trustworthy or more valid claims can be made about the observations that are being made. Because if each practitioner is different and they're reporting something different, that makes superficial sense because they're different people. They have different ideas, they'll try different things, and their ability to know for sure which part of what they did had the outcome that they saw may be minimized. They weren't likely rigid experimenters to try to work towards falsification. So, or work in a falsifiable manner, work in a way whereby if what I say or what I think is going to happen does happen, I can see it. And if what I think is going to happen doesn't happen, they can also see it. So, or it can be observed. That then, to some degree, increases the confidence that it's harder to trust the claims of these osteopathic practitioners because the recording methods weren't fantastic. It doesn't mean they weren't doing what they said they were doing. It just means it's harder to trust. It's harder to have confidence in. Also that they reported varying areas, varying protocols. Generally speaking, it overlapped relatively well, where you're looking kind of T1 to T8-ish, Rib 1 to Rib 8-ish, and looking at then adding in over time, because later on you see a little bit more discussion about the cervical column because you're trying to get the middle and lower cervical sympathetic chain ganglia, and then sometimes they talk about excretory functions and other times they don't. But on a superficial level, if they're speaking even in the same relative area, but there's a lot of variance in detail, it's harder to buy and have high confidence that the hands-on methods were the things driving the specific results, especially when you see the inclusion over time of diet, hygiene, and exercise in these reports. So that doesn't mean the hands-on work did nothing. That doesn't mean the hands-on work wasn't the primary driver of the changes they were getting. But it does mean that it's harder to have high degrees of confidence. As an example, when superficially seeing discussions about pulmonary tuberculosis and in similar or in the same journals, seeing discussions of asthma, asthma was discussed with slightly different locations within anatomy or different ranges within the thoracic region. So we'll end up looking at that over time and see if there's similarity or if there's difference, because if there is similarity, well, then a lung's a lung, osteopathically. If different, then they at least had reason to believe that a lung wasn't a lung, that I should go to these different areas. But if we see a wide variety of reports for asthma, go here, go the other place, and then go another place again, then it becomes a similar phenomenon to tuberculosis and consumption, pulmonary tuberculosis anyways, and consumption, such that it's just harder to have confidence that it was the hands-on work. The hands-on work was consistently there, but if it was reported in a highly variable way, or the protocols were reported highly variable, then it's either it doesn't matter what you do, or it wasn't the thing driving the outcomes being observed. So project continues. We'll give more results over time. We'll do more work over time. If you want to look at this stuff, you can. The vast majority of the resources that we're finding are from the Museum of Osteopathic History. They have a research collection which has, well, I think it's osteopathic journals and books, rather. They have a bunch of osteopathic journals and books. Atlas, and the Bulletin of the Atlas and Axis Club. I think there's like the Osteopathic Herald. There's a bunch of osteopathic books early on. There is the Charles E. Still Jr. collection, Journal of Osteopathy, Osteopathic Truth, Osteopathic Physician. There's a lot of stuff there. And it is relatively representative of the early portions of the profession, while not completely representative. There's one that, there's a journal that I consistently see mentioned that I have no access to. I think it's Osteopathic Health. And I think it's usually when I'm reading the Osteopathic Physician that it talks about osteopathic health, where they had more specific reports about some of these things, as far as I can see based on the quotes that I can find. So it would be interesting to find that. As a theme goes, I'm not sure it would show something different, but we don't know until we are able to access that. So I may attempt to get in touch with the Museum of Osteopathic History and see if they have any representation of that other journal. So hopefully you've listened and enjoyed this so far. Hopefully you've learned something. Thanks for sticking around, and we will talk again soon.